Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Paul Moore. I'm from Ireland, and I'm very honoured to be here, very happy to be here, and to thank the organising committee for their invitation. We have two wonderful speakers this evening, Vittorio Gallese and Andrea Scalabrini, and we're going to start with Professor Gallese. So Vittorio Gallese is a medical doctor and trained neurologist, professor of psychobiology at the University of Parma, Italy, where he is director of the Lab of Social Cognitive Neuroscience, fellow at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America of Columbia University, New York, USA, honorary fellow of the Institute of Philosophy of the School of Advanced Study of the University of London, UK honorary member of the American College of Psychiatrists and member of the Academia Europea. He's a cognitive neuroscientist. His research focuses on the relation between the sensory motor system and social cognition by investigating the neurobiological grounding of intersubjectivity, psychopathology, language, and aesthetics. He is the author of more than 300 scientific publications and 4 books.
First of all, let me thank the organizer, particularly Rosa, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Before getting to my talk, quite an unorthodox start, but I was kindly reminded by Massimo Ammaniti to take this chance to announce this international meeting that will take place in May here in Rome to celebrate the 40th anniversary of a book that I'm pretty sure changed the professional life of many of the people in this room. It certainly did change my view of many things. And the book is The Interpersonal World of the Infant, which was published by Daniel Stern in 1985. Daniel Stern was a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst. Let me add, perhaps not entirely acknowledged by the psychoanalytic community. He was a pioneer of infant research together with Colwyn Trevarten at Tronic. And this international conference is meant to celebrate his legacy and to show how alive are his thoughts in informing current research in this field. So please check this out, and if you can, take part to this, which is going to be a very exciting scientific event. Okay, now pay tribute to Daniel Stern. I would like to move to my talk. I will address the complex relationship between body and the notion of body and the notion of images from a very different point of view with respect to the very interesting talks we heard this morning. Namely, the relationship here is between images, mostly images that we create, and the body. The first relationship that comes to mind about the relationship between man-made images, and the body is that the body produces images. The point I will stress throughout my talk is that the body is simultaneously the key instrument to make sense of those images. I'd like to start with a quote from a book that just got published at the end of last year. The author is Michele Cometa, Paleoaesthetic at the Origin of Visual Culture. Begin quote, "The naivete of our spectator, the spectator watching Paleolithic images, is grounded not only in the fact that looking and seeing are eminently biocultural phenomena, where the physiology of the eye and the ways of seeing, to use John Berger's term, contribute to shaping the scopic regimes that articulate image making, but also, and above all, in the fact that every image and every artistic artifact as the phenomenological perspective has taught us, constitutes a projection of the self, a metonymy of the self, not in the sense of a mere prosthesis. Through the image, the self is constituted, founded in a relationship where alienation is merely the other side of the construction of subjectivity. So in other words, through the making of images, we make our self, our own self, more opaque, more visible. We become more aware of ourselves also through image making. Okay, that said, this is going to be the outline of my talk. I will start from a definition of aesthetic and aesthetic experience. To move on the embodiment of images, I will introduce embodied simulation as a model, a theoretical model, empirically based, of perception and imagination, few empirical results from our lab, and then I will try to make some temporary conclusion. First, aesthetics. When we think about aesthetics nowadays, it's a prevalent dimension of our lives, particularly so in the age of the Web 2.0 and of social networks. In this account, aesthetics squares with cosmetics. So we are very concerned with our aesthetic image. We build our image by carefully manufacturing the way we present ourselves on the web, occasionally relying on software that make our image more appealing, eventually even with the help of cosmetic surgery. I want to start from the original definition of aesthetics, namely aesthesis, the multimodal perception of the world through the body. Later on, this term was used to, so to speak, define a discipline in charge of describing arts and artistic beauty. But even in the words of the founder of modern aesthetics, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, in 1750, he wrote, "Aesthetics is the science of sensitive knowing." So by sensitive knowing, again, we rely on the body, the senses, and agency. More recently, a comparatist, a German scholar that moved to the United States after realizing that his much revered mentor, Professor Jauss, was a Nazi, so he decided to quit Germany, leave the country for good, although he occasionally visits Germany. He's a great fan of German soccer, but he made all of his career at Stanford University. Hans Gumbrecht, he published in 2004 a very influential book, The Production of Presence, What Meaning Cannot Convey, where I took this quote: "What we call aesthetic experience, aesthetisches Erleben, always provides us with certain feelings of intensity we cannot find in the historically and culturally specific everyday worlds that we inhabit." So to develop further Gumbrecht intuition, what we now call art is probably the most genuine form of augmented reality. We don't need to rely on Google glasses to have an intensified rendering of reality. We do this since the very beginning of our history as a species by means of cultural artifacts. So the question is, how do we embody images? I proposed many years ago what still is most likely an unconventional approach to the aesthetic experience of works of art. And as you will notice, I never mention neuroaesthetics. I'm not interested to plant flags in the brain to locate the neurons in charge of the sense of beauty, the neurons in charge of the sense of sublime. I'm interested in experience. How do we experience images? So I'm not so much concerned with the and hyper-localizationist attitude, which is a risk contemporary neuroscience is facing. Occasionally, I speak of high-tech phrenology, okay? If you know what I mean. So the unconventionality of my approach stems from three starting assumptions quite different from the mainstream neuroscientific approach to aesthetics, namely neuroaesthetics. First, vision is a process far more complex than the mere activation of the so-called visual brain. We are dealing with a topic that has been already discussed in the morning session, multimodality, multisensory integration. Our visual experience of the world is the outcome of multimodal integration processes in which the motor system is a key player. I declare my bias. I'm a motor chauvinist. I tend to see things from the agency point of view. Thought is action. So to be clear. Second, aesthetic experience must be framed within social cognition and intersubjectivity, as works of art and cultural artifacts in general are mediators of the relationship between the subjectivities of creators and beholders. Third, aesthetic experience can be qualified as a social practice. So let me move my first blow, which goes against oculocentrism, or in Italian we would say puro visibilismo. Why do I say that? Because observing the world is more complex than the mere activation of the visual brain. Vision is multimodal. It encompasses the activation of motor, somatosensory, and emotion-related brain networks. Our motor potentialities shape and define the world we perceive. One of the biggest discoveries done by the Parma group, well before we bumped into the so-called mirror neurons, was the finding that part of our motor system can be active without the production of any overt movement. What we are dealing in that type of activation of the motor system that does not produce movement is motor simulation. And this motor simulation is a key ingredient in building our world, our Umwelt, to use von Neusch's expression. Our brain body expresses the range of potential relationship with the world that lead to the establishment of a relational self, modeling and delimiting the horizon of the world in which we live. We know and understand our world, our Umwelt, as I said, by virtue of the relational potentialities instantiated by our body, which in turn shape and model the brain's sensory-motor schemas. If we investigate the functional properties of the ventral premotor cortex of the macaque brain, we discover motor neurons that not only determine movements like reaching movements, but that also respond to tactile stimuli applied to the same body part, to visual stimuli approaching the same body part, or even auditory stimuli that occur in the vicinity of the same body part. In a neighboring premotor area F5, there are other classes of motor neurons that control the performance of goal-related hand movements like grasping objects, manipulating them. These neurons not only activate during the execution of the grasping action, but also during the mere observation of the object that the same neuron controls the grasping of. So without any movement, the monkey looks at that object, the neuron fires. What is this discharge? This discharge is the translation of the physical feature of the object, its size, dimension, orientation, into the motor schema that the monkey could potentially employ in order to interact with that same object. So it's not required that the monkey actively act upon the object to evoke this motor response. This is the motor simulation of a grasping that at that moment doesn't occur. This is relevant. It's not only monkey business, so to speak, because the same properties later on were detected by means of brain imaging and other techniques also in our brain. So also in our brain there are premotor parietal circuits that display the very same properties that we originally discovered in the macaque monkey brain. So frontoparietal motor areas are neurally integrated not only to control action, which is what you expect from motor neurons. Motor neurons are there to generate movement, but that's only one part of the story. They also serve the function of building an integrated, bodily formatted mapping of actions, mirror neurons, I'll come to in a minute, objects, canonical neurons, locations to which actions are directed, F4 neurons, and peripersonal space. Okay. So as I said at the beginning, aesthetic experience of man-made images qualify as a mediated form of intersubjectivity. The subjectivity of who creates the cultural artifact, the subjectivity of the beholder, and the object, the cultural artifact, goes between the two subjectivity, is the mediator of this mediated form of relation. Mirror neurons allowed us to look at intersubjectivity from a complementary perspective to the traditional mind-reading canon. Okay, so we look at other people's behavior. This behavior, according to this classic cognitive view, would be intentionally opaque in order to understand what the other is doing, why he's doing what he's doing. I need to start from the behavior, but refer this behavior to something hidden, a mental representation. And in order to make sense of the other mental representation, I need to build in my mind a meta representation of that mental representation. So intersubjectivity, spelled out in such a way, is uniquely metacognition. This is not the only game in town. I mean, the most minimal statement we can make after 30 years of discoveries in this realm is that intersubjectivity is, at the very least, if not mainly, intercorporating. So let me be very quick, because I'm sure mirror neurons are already familiar to you. Neurons, motor neurons that control the execution of go-related motor acts, but also responding to similar motor acts being performed by others without any overt movement. More recently, our colleagues in Tübingen University discovered something that is quite relevant in today's age of screens. They tested mirror neurons during the observation of an action performed by a living agent physically present in front of the macaque with an action displayed on a bidimensional computer screen. And the outcome of the experiment is that practically all mirror neurons responding to both. Half display a stronger activation for the naturalistic action, the other half respond with an equal intensity to both the naturalistic and the filmed action. Since macaques do not watch television in their natural environment, there are no computer display in the jungle, this, I think, bespeak the incredible relevance, evolutionary relevance of this mechanism. It is so important for a primate to understand what the other is doing, to monitor the other action and understand the meaning of the action, that the medium conveying this type of content is almost irrelevant. And indeed, we can detect ourselves, we can recognize our own from our uncle, even looking at the dots of light dot display. Johansson in Sweden was among the first to show that even an impoverished visual moving stimuli, like dots coherently moving against a black background, can be recognized as a guy climbing up a chair, a lady riding a bicycle, or even recognize yourself from some other. So the richness of the stimulus is not so relevant because these stimuli are incredibly important for our survival, even more so for a species like ours, which is constitutionally neotenic. We are born immature because of the upper stance. The birth canal got narrowed, so our brain at birth weighs a few hundred grams before reaching complete maturation at the end of adolescence, where it weighs about 1,300, 1,400 grams. It means that the vast majority of brain growth happens after birth, where within a dense network of interpersonal relationship. And this most likely, much more than the deus ex machina solution proposed by the MIT guys like Steven Pinker, the gene of syntax, the gene of grammar, FOXP2, a gene mutation, and voila, the hairy guy is turned into a speaking human being. That's, it's a nice subject to be seen in Syracuse in the Greek amphitheater, right? No, I mean, our being a social species so much concerned to understand the other stems most likely from the fact that we totally depend on the other. For many months or even years without the other, we are totally lost. We couldn't survive. And this most likely exerted a very strong evolutionary pressure to develop cognitive skills that enable us to make ourselves understood and to understand what the other are doing toward us. 3 years ago, to celebrate, so to speak, the 30th anniversary of the first publication of mirror neurons, Luca Bonini, myself, and two of our PhD students, Cristina Rotunno and Edoardo Arcuri, published this review, which is in Intrinsic Cognitive Sciences, showing how old is this mechanism. It has been found in birds, in bats, in mice, in rats, and of course, in our brain. In each of these different species, it serves partially different adaptive roles. The common aspect that brings together mirroring properties in this living species so far away in evolutionary times, millions and millions of years apart, the common ground is to make sense of others' behavior. In our brain, these are the areas that turn out to be active during the execution, the observation, and the imagination of goal-related action, symbolic communicative action, and mere body movements. What happens when images portraying movements are still, are static? The more dynamic they look, the stronger the activation of the motor system. So even when we don't see an action during its development, but we see a static image portraying that action, our motor system simulates it. It simulates more strongly when the dynamic coefficient of the static image is also higher. But this is not the whole story, because later on we discovered that similar mirroring mechanism, simulation mechanisms, could be detected also in the domain of emotions and sensations. Just to snapshot about physical disgust, the anterior insula here is active when I feel generally physically disgusted, but also when I witness the facial expression of disgust of someone else. Clearly, the overlap is only partial. Otherwise, we couldn't tell the difference between being disgusted and recognizing an emotion we do not share physically. It turns out that in spite of the fact that the same part of the insula is active in both instances, when we are disgusted and when we witness the expression of disgust on the face of someone else, the dynamic brain connectivity in these two different phenomenal situations is different, okay? And that accounts from the fact that if I see someone showing disgust, I don't necessarily feel myself disgusted, but I recognize that as disgust. The same occurs in the domain of touch. This is the second somatosensory area, where there is a second large coarse homunculus telling with different neurons activated by touch experience in different parts of their body. We were the first to show that this area can be driven not only by touch being experienced on your body, but also when you see someone else being touched on the body. And the same occurs also for pain. Anterior cingulate cortex, anterior insula are activated both when we feel pain, but also when we witness someone else's pain, and the same has been shown at the neural level, even in rodents, in the same brain areas, by the way. Okay, so what is embodied simulation? It's a functional mechanism of the brain which makes possible our rich and diversified experience of space, objects, other individuals, being at the basis of our capacity to empathize. A short qualification. Empathy is neither good or bad. There's nothing good in being empathetic. Being empathetic means feeling with the other, not for the other. So I can use my empathic reading of the other to produce harm in the other, to bully the other, to mob the other. As long as I can identify weak points in the other, I can exploit my empathic knowledge of the other, not to do good to the other, but the other way around. So we shouldn't mix up sympathy and empathy. Empathizing has nothing to do with being good. In order to sympathize, you must be empathetic, but you can be empathetic without necessarily sympathizing with the other. So embodied simulation not only connects us to others, it connects us to our world, a world populated by natural objects, man-made objects, with or without symbolic nature, and other individuals, a world in which most of the time, and not all the time, we feel at home. And it is an exemplification of a basic functional mechanism of the brain. Neural reuse. By means of neural reuse, we can get rid of all the controversies and misunderstanding about the apparent unique vocation of a given brain area to support a specific function. Take Broca's area. If you ask 100 neuroscientists, 98 of them probably, well, I'm being pessimistic, let's say 90, will say Broca's area, language production, period. But if you see a finger pressing a key and you are supposed to imitate that very simple movement, Marco Iacoboni was the first at UCLA to show you see a bilateral activation of Broca's region. There is a lot of overlap between apparently unrelated function, bodily, cognitive, in a variety of brain areas. So if neuroscience is supposed to produce a localization for every single word or concept that we use to verbally describe our cognitive life, it is bound to total failure. This is one of the few things I'm totally convinced of. So a given cognitive function can be supported by a variety of brain circuits. The newer, in evolutionary term, a cognitive function is, and most likely, the wider is the brain circuit underpinning it. There are not so many colleagues entertaining this view. One of the most vocal in the last 15 years or so is Michael Anderson. So if you want to learn more about neural reuse, I invite you to read his BBS paper, which appeared in 2010, specifically devoted to neural reuse. Okay, so aesthetic experience of cultural artifacts. This has been an exciting part of my career due to my acquaintance with David Friedberg, I met him in Milan attending to a talk he gave on the power of images. I invited him to give a talk in our department. We became acquainted, we decided to collaborate, and this collaboration firstly produced this paper that we published in 2007. In this paper, Motion, Emotion, and Empathy in Aesthetic Experience, we basically started with bracketing, epoché. It's a phenomenological toolkit, so to speak. So we decided to bracket the artistic dimension of visual works of art and focus on the embodied phenomena induced in the course of contemplating such works by virtue of their visual content. And we illustrated the neural mechanism underpinning the empathetic power of images. Not coincidentally, among other things, David Friedberg has been a scholar of iconoclasm. Why are we so obsessed repeatedly in the course of human history to destroy images? We have seen examples quite recently in Afghanistan, where the big Buddha statue were destroyed. Later on in Syria, a lot of images, statues have been destroyed, even in continental Europe. During the religious war, images were, the eyes of human figures were eliminated. Why so? Because images have a sort of agency. And some scholars in aesthetics, like Horst Brederkamp, clearly speak of an iconic act. So we look at images, but images at the same time look at us. When navigating the parallel world of cultural artifacts, we basically rely on the same brain-body resources shaped by our relation to mundane reality. The body is one, so is the brain. So I never understood why we have to rely on terms like quasi-emotion. If I go to the opera house here, not far away from here, and I attend to a very good performance of Traviata, in the third act, I constantly weep. Are these quasi-tears? I don't think so. This is a genuine emotion produced by the very same brain circuits that produce my genuine emotion when I'm not attending to an opera, but I'm involved in some moving event of my mundane life. These resources provide the functional scaffold and the building blocks that our engagement with culture rearranges by means of different forms of framing. There is, of course, a cognitive framing that guides my bodily reaction, my cultural background, the tradition in which I have been educated, what I know about the artist, and we are not canceling that out. It's not just a bodily business, of course. But the bodily component of aesthetic experience has been for too long neglected. After it flourished at the end of the 19th century in Germany with people like Vischer, Wölfflin, and later on one of my heroes, Aby Warburg, among others. Okay, just to entertain you, I decided to pick some images. You can see, if you have a Caravaggio walk here in Rome, this is the Deposizione from Musei Vaticani. This is Giudice Oloferme, is in Palazzo Barberini, with very interesting details. So these are static images, okay? Nothing moves in the frame. However, from those static images, we can build a narrative. How does it happen? Let me offer you my guess. Through the movement captured in the image of an instant, the observer transforms the instant into the story of a movement that comes from the past and continues projected in the future. We recognize the instant as part of a movement that has a past and a future. The past is the movement that has taken that body or that limb up to the moment depicted in the image we are observing. The future is the predictable spatial trajectory and the final point of arrival that body or limb would plausibly reach after a time inversely proportional to the kinetic energy deployed. The more kinetic energy is put into the production of the movement, the faster will be the arrival. So embodied simulation transforms the image into the figure of a story. Taking the argument to the extreme, we could say that the power and emotional effectiveness of images lies precisely in their ability to concentrate and condense a story in the figure of an instant, thus demonstrating the relationship between movement, time, and narrative. Let me quickly say something on another aspects of our relation to images that would deserve in itself an entire talk: haptic vision. This is Bernard Berenson looking at this statue, I guess, of Paolina Bonaparte. And he famously wrote in the Italian Painters of the Renaissance that he wrote in 1932 the following lines: Giotto's greatness in comparison with Cimabue, his mentor, was to have satisfied the first condition of painting as art, to stimulate our tactile imagination. And now we can provide an empirical background to this statement, because when we see tactile contact, we literally simulate it by setting into action part of our own tactile stimulus, tactile part of the brain. So the haptic quality of an image is not only a metaphor, is an empirical fact. What about images that do not portray human bodies, abstract art? The first time I presented this paper, I think it was in Rome in Via Panama. And during discussion, one of your colleagues told me, gestures, this is a vagina. I said, well, it may well be. Every image is polysemic, so we can project a variety of meaning to this image. What we demonstrated is that this image, among the many connections that can produce or favor, is an old idea put forward by August von Hildebrand at the end of the 19th century, literally to evoke a simulation of the gesture that has been produced to realize that image. We first show that with graphic sign. When we look at letter of the alphabet, of the Roman alphabet, or Chinese ideograms or scribbles, your motor brain is activated. And quite interesting, is more activated by the graphic sign taken from written languages than from the scribbles. And there are many alternative explanations for this interesting effect. The same occurs when you behold un concetto spaziale of Lucio Fontana or the materic brush strokes of Franz Klein. In other words, when looking at the graphic sign, we unconsciously simulate the gesture that has produced it, and this non-conscious response includes bodily framing and sensory motor activation of the simulating kind. Let me close with an aspect of aesthetic experience that normally is considered to be as remote as possible from the body: aesthetic judgment. How artistically beautiful is the image I'm beholding? So the question here was, are bodily driven sensory motor processes involved in the explicit judgment of aesthetic beauty? We first tried to answer this question with a behavioral experiment. The volunteers were supposed to look at images taken from paintings from the 16th and 17th century, portraying either physical pain or neutral facial expressions. And they were supposed to evaluate the artistic beauty of that image on a Likert scale, but in two conditions: with their face relaxed or by actively frowning. And it turns out that when you emit this aesthetic judgment when frowning only for the images portraying pain, they see them as more artistically beautiful with respect to when they make their judgment with their face relaxed. But this manipulation has no impact on the evaluation of the artistic beauty of the neutral faces. So it's not an unspecific effect due to the fact that when you contract your corrugator muscles, you are more focused. If this were the case, this manipulation should have affected all the aesthetic judgment and not only the aesthetic judgment of the painting that were portraying physical pain, okay? There's also another interesting result emerging from this study. Participants' empathetic traits and art experience correlated directly with the amplitude of the motor enactment effect on the aesthetic judgment. So this effect, by contracting your frowning actively, that leads to judging as more artistically beautiful a painting portraying physical pain, this effect is stronger among the participants who score higher with questionnaire evaluating their empathetic traits. And finally, we wanted to know about the brain basis of this effect. So we did an fMRI study in which we presented a variety of faces, human faces of strangers displaying physical pain or a neutral expression, and again, artistic pain versus artistic no pain. And the results were quite interesting. The observation of facial expressions of pain, both artistic and non-artistic, activates brain regions related to empathy for pain, anterior insula and anterior cingulate cortex. But most interestingly, the higher the activation of empathy for pain brain regions, the higher the aesthetic judgment, of artistic beauty of painful facial expressions. So we planted different seeds in the right and left anterior insula, in the anterior cingulate cortex, and in the fusiform face area, a visual area which is specifically driven by the observation of human faces. We couldn't spot any modulation in the visual area, while we saw a modulation in the areas that are active when we feel pain or when we recognize pain in someone else. So there is a clear-cut relationship between our artistic aesthetic evaluation of these specific images, artistic images, and the activation of the circuit that normally kicks in either when we feel pain or we witness the pain of someone else. I will never write a paper with the title, Why Immanuel Kant Was Wrong. I want to be clear. This could be a specific case of aesthetic judgment, and is up to us to replicate in other domains, in other aesthetic domains. After all, here we are dealing with aesthetic pain. But the point I want to make is that even when we formulate an aesthetic judgment, oh, this is how artistically beautiful I think this painting is, the body is always relevant, also there. Okay, I'm almost done. What we see is not simply the visual recording in our brains of what is presented before our eyes, but the result of a complex construction, the product of which derives from the fundamental contribution of our bodies with our motor potentials, our senses and emotions, our imaginations, and our memories. Man-made images are the locus of virtual interaction, constituting a sophisticated form of mediated intersubjectivity. These elements, in my opinion, of course, are connected to the function of embodied simulation. The ways through which beholders connect to images are not only offline mental processes, but primarily online bodily forms of intersubjectivity. And I want to conclude with a quote from one of my favorite novel writers, who was a philosopher by training. Actually, he gave up a position in philosophy to pursue his career as a narrator. And in this expression, I think, lies what cognitive neuroscience should be aiming to. Genauigkeit und Seele. Soul and precision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vittorio, for a wonderful presentation. We started a little bit late, so we're going to push on fairly quickly. We've no time for questions at the moment, but there will be an opportunity after a coffee break for plenty of questions. So I'm going to move on quickly and just give a brief introduction to Andrea Scalabrini. Andrea Scalabrini is a psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, a neuroscientist with a strong interest in the self and its dynamic and traumatic effects on the mind-body-brain system. He is currently an assistant professor at the University of Bergamo, Department of Human and Social Sciences. He has collaborated and still collaborates with experts in the field like Georg Nordhoff and Clara Mucci to explore the intersection of psychoanalysis and neuroscience, emphasizing the importance of interdisciplinary exchanges and the potential for a bridge between the two fields.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Thank you to Claudia, Francesco, and Rosa, that I don't know where she is now, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very glad. I started to be here with Georg Nordhoff, my mentor, my research mentor years ago. And now I'm here as a speaker, so for me it's a great compliment first. So thank you very much for inviting me. So here just present you an outline. So I will not focus very much on body image and the difference with body schema. I'm not a huge fan of this distinction, to be honest. So I will focus more on the concept of bodily self, that for me encompass both of them. So that's where we will start. Where does the bodily self come from? Then the role of affected touch and the body simulation. And then we will see like the psychopathological implication in narcissism. Then I will introduce you a concept I'm working on currently that is a psychological or psychophysiological baseline. And then we will see an example of psychopathology of touch. Then finally we will move to this 3 level of self that already Rosa introduced a little bit in the morning. And someone asked about dissociation today, so we will get a little bit more deep into the concept and clinical phenomena of dissociation. And then we will have 2 examples of post-traumatic disorders and anorexia nervosa. So let's start with psychoanalysis. I'm a psychoanalyst myself. I'm Jungian, okay, and I'm proud to be Jungian. And but both Freud and Jung already introduced the concept of bodily self. Freud used to say that the self is first and foremost the bodily self. Jung was introducing the concept of subtle body. Subtle body for him was a somatic unconsciousness. That is the mirror, that is the parallel, it paralleled the mental unconscious. And, he worked a lot with Wolfgang Pauli, the physics, on physics and on the relation between matter and psyche. So that's why soma, body, matter, and psyche might have a very deep intertwined relationship. So where our bodily self come from? So today Vittorio started to speak about Stern and the legacy of Stern and Trevarten and the concept of attunement. I mean, in psychotherapy now we cannot exclude the importance of intersubjectivity departing from the caregiver, mother-infant experience. So our body is our first object that our mind, our psyche, get in contact with through the mirror, the attunement, the synchronization with the other. So the other, as a caregiver, is the most important person that give us the possibility to get in touch, being connected with our bodily self. So Colvin Trevarten was a pioneer on this, and I like this when he speaks about synchronization. He says that the synchronized proto-conversation co-creates a reciprocal intersubject system of non-verbal communication, where emotion constitute a vital space-time of brain, mind, and behavioral state that represent signals for communication with others and are immediately open to the influence of signal from the others. So this a co-shared and co-built field. Interestingly, he used to say that our body is wired to be social. And also Vittorio Gallese here, he has a very nice study that is called Wired to be Social, where he studied twins, and he showed that at the 14th week of gestation, twin fetuses do not only display movements directed towards the uterine, but also movements specifically aimed at the co-twin, the proportion of which increases between the 14 and 18 gestational weeks. So meaning the twins in the womb, they are looking for each other. They are synchronizing with each other. And this is actually extremely interesting and fascinating. So while for decades cognitive sciences focused especially on the perception of external signals, so finally we are moving inside, so we study more interoception, but especially we study the homeostatic condition of our entire body, brain, mind system. We cannot, we cannot make the Descartes error of splitting the tube. So we are a whole entity. But where does this homeostasis come from? How is this necessary for the development of ourselves, and what are the implications for psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapists? So let's move still on neuroscience. So in neuroscience, there is the group around Feldman-Barrett. She proposed a model that mirrors our attachment system. She says that the relationship between the caregiver and the child is a necessary homeostatic regulation. What do I mean? That pass through the insula, anterior insula. I don't want to debate about the locationist versus non-locationist approach, but the location of areas in the brain is important, and then you will see why. So the topography of the brain is important to understand which area is deputed to a certain function. So insula is very important. Insula is the crossroads between what we feel and what we mentally represent, and you will see why. So it's the crossroads between the processing of our internal sensation with the external stimulation from the outside. So insula is very, very important. So what does Feldman say? Feldman says that the interaction with the mother teach or let the infant experience and regulate his internal sensation and the response towards the external environment. As you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the neonate, so this, for example, is the DMN, the full mode network system. So when we are born, our DMN is not fully constituted. It's constituted during time. And how does the DMN, that is the network of the self, to make it simple, develop? It probably develops towards the interaction with the other. The synchronized interaction with the other help the synchronization between the different areas of the brain that might have a future function that are important for our self-related processing, for emotional processing, emotional regulation, and so on. So the external synchronization mirror kind of internal brain synchronization, because when we look at the network, we are not looking at anything transcendental. So the regions that you see enlightened here, it means that they are synchronized with each other. Okay, so it's purely correlational approach. The two brain regions are synchronized. That's what it means. So let's move a little bit to my research. So because of this, as we started to have an idea that the spontaneous activity of the brain might be very important, and I will explain you why. So my first research were in collaboration with Georg Northoff, but also with Shur Debish in the University of Chieti. And then, based on Vittorio Gallese research on touch, we started to develop a paradigm, very ecological. So we studied how embodied simulation, anticipation of intersubjective touch is represented in the brain and how is modulated by narcissistic features of the participants. So in this case, as you can see, we asked the participants to don't watch any film or any screen. We were asking the participant to be very active in actively touching another human being, or like a fake hand, like an inanimate being, okay? So, and we were focusing especially on the anticipation of touch. So we were interested in how our brain prepares to touch someone else. What did we find? We found that in the anticipation of the animate touch, the left postcentral gyrus, that is a mirror neuron area, is very active, together with the cerebellum, and also the anterior insula plays a strong role, as anterior right insula. Intriguingly, anterior insula also correlated with narcissistic grandiosity scores. Less activation of insula, more narcissistic grandiosity features, and it makes complete sense, okay? Moreover, we were looking at resting state spontaneous activity of the brain, because our idea is that all these intersubjective encounters, from the attachment to our adulthood, doesn't matter, are rooted in our spontaneous activity of the brain, okay? What do you do when you don't think about anything? You think about yourself, what you have to buy at the supermarket, your significant others. This is your spontaneous mind wandering that has a correlation with our spontaneous activity of the brain. So the spontaneous activity of the brain correlated with the anticipation, especially in mirror neuron area, somatosensory one, and anterior insula. Very interesting. So, what was our hypothesis? How did we interpret? We interpret this data thinking that other individuals are approached as entities with similar internal experiences ourselves. Moreover, both areas, especially anterior insula and somatosensory regions, have been associated with the perception of sensation and feelings of both oneself and the others. Where narcissism comes from? Narcissists come from the idea that, you know, they have a relational disengagement towards other people, but at the same time, they are very highly self-preoccupied about themselves. So this was our idea, that narcissistic grandiosity are very self-absorbed during the spontaneous activity of the brain, and at the same time, they are disengaged from intersubjective encounters. So still, let's stay a little bit more on touch. With Schurd and another colleague of mine called Simone Di Plinio from Chiedi, we wrote this with this paper. I love this paper because I wrote with friends. So when you do science with friends with different expertise, it has a different taste. And you know, Schurd is a cognitive scientist, I'm a psychodynamic psychotherapist and a neuroscientist. Simone, and so I'm interested in psychopathology. Simone is more into physiology. So we wrote from different perspectives. We wrote this paper about the relevance of touch. The idea, I already said to you, is that in our resting state are rooted our experiences, and these predispose kind of our brain to react towards external stimuli, any kind of stimuli. Like, who cares? I mean, affective, cognitive, social, and so on. So in the field, there is Maria Grazia Spitoni. Maria Grazia Spitoni, thanks for being here, I use one of your papers to support my idea, because Maria Grazia showed that people with disorganized attachment has less pleasure in being touched and touching other people. Okay, so this also mirrors findings about borderline personality disorder that interpret neutral faces as fearful faces or raged, you know, so they project on neutrality. So the same is rooted in our body, in our touch experiences. Again, this also goes with another paper of ours where we found that in the spontaneous activity of the brain, in the anterior cingulate cortex, there is already an information about intersubjectivity. So in our anterior cingulate cortex, there is the information of how we differentiate animate intersubjective encounters versus inanimate ones. So this is fascinating for us, because it means that our brain is kind of wired to be social, and all our social experiences are rooted into that. This is not so different from what we do in clinical practice. When we meet the patients, what do? We try to give them a diagnosis about their personality and how this impact on their life, and how does, will impact about their prognosis based on the history that they tell us. So we are very interested in the subjective frame, the neural subjective frame. So there are a lot of neuroscientists working on this. The group around Talon-Baudry in France really made a lot of good research about that. But this is also about, so to speak more in psychological terms, this is what is called now mentalization of the body. So the information that comes from our body is extremely important. And another neuroscientist called Buddy Craig, introduced the idea that our anterior insula is in constant relationship with our prefrontal cortices. And this relationship, this synchronization between insula and anterior cingulate cortex tells us about the continuity of ourself, our constant monitoring of how do we feel, that lead us to how we experience ourselves, how do we have mental representation. I work constantly with Georg Northoff, but also Antonio Damasio and Jaak Panksepp. They tried to introduce this level, the different layers model of self, and this is what we are working on currently. So we work on a tripartite model of the self, departing from the interoceptive. So how do we process internal signals? That then is a nested model, as you can see. You can imagine an onion. So try to visualize an onion. The core of the onion is the interoceptive one. Then another layer is the exteroproprioceptive, so the relationship with the outside world. So there is still no mental images. Mental images is the last level, is the mental self. But at the beginning, so there is only the internal sensation and the information about external reality. Also the posture. So in the morning, Shaun spoke a lot about the posture, the movements, or the proxemics. So this is all about exteroproprioceptive self. So what did we find? We found in this paper that the right anterior insula is very important. Why? Because the right anterior insula, maybe I didn't show you enough, you can see it here, is the common denominator of all the different layers. So it's the first regions that is important, the interaction between caregiver and mother and infants, and is the same region that is present in all different layers, interoceptive, extero, mental. We found in this paper that, the insula has the same role with the other regions of the brain in the interoceptive network, but it increased the degree of centrality, so all roads don't lead to Rome, but pass through insula, more you increase your level that lead you to mental representation, okay? So it becomes more and more important, especially at the latest stage. So we started to create a model, okay? So first we proposed this model at the psychological level, saying, okay, so this synchrony between mother and child is very important because gives you, let's say, the building blocks of your subjective experience that let you feel that you have a self and that your self is coherent, is continuous during time, and connects your experience from the internal body with the world and stuff like that. So, and this is mirrored by this brain model. But what does it happen if you experience trauma, if something goes wrong, departing from the misattunement between mother and child? Probably it leads to dissociation. Dissociation, that's the way I formulate. I formulate dissociation as a disconnectedness, desynchronization that happens outside, desynchronization with the caregiver and the other people, but also happens in the brain. And what do you expect? Which regions of the brain might be very much implicated? Again, the anterior insula. In this work, I try to do like a theoretical critique on Pierre Janet, departing from l'automatisme psychologique, and trying to see also what happens in the brain. So in the brain, people that have more predisposition to dissociate, they have a less synchronization between the insula and the rest of the brain. So with Georg Northoff, departing from this, we try to build up this project for spatial temporal neuroscience. And, in this case, again, as you can see, the self, that, it's very interesting for us as a psychologist, can be a nice proxy to study what we call the common currency between phenomenological experience and brain activity or brain connectivity. So going back to our model, what happens if you have trauma? If you have trauma, instead of expanding the level of self from interoception to exteroception to mental, probably you don't have any possibility to process mentally the stimuli. Because that's what is dissociation. What happens in dissociation? Why dissociation is different from repression? Why is different from splitting? Dissociation is a disconnection of your own experience from your own consciousness. But, as there are a lot of books now, there is Van der Kolk in US that say the body keeps the score. Yes, the body keeps the score. What does it mean? That your activity is embedded and is rooted in your interoceptive, non-conscious experience. So you feel you have a somatic experience, but you don't have any mental images, any mental contents. That's what we do with patients, come on. So that's probably what it happens. Instead of having an expansion, you have a shrinking of your mental experiences, and everything is rooted and embedded in the interoceptive, exteroceptive level. And this is exactly what dissociation is for us. So this is, you cannot see, this is an article of Clara Mucci where she tries to develop a psychopathology based on dissociation versus repression. While in repression, according to Freud, yourself is already mature enough. Otto Kemberg might say you have a neurotic personality organization, so you use repression. So your contents are already processed. And then there is a conflict. You cannot deal with that, and then you repress. Dissociation is completely the opposite. You don't have any possibility to process and integrate contents. So the work with patients might be completely different. Okay? So actually for me, this is a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. So if you work with people with trauma, you should work with the body on the affective level. So this was a model. Did we confirm this model? Yes, recently we finally published in this in Molecular Psychiatry, that is a Nature journal, this paper. And when the interoexteroceptive self keeps the score, that's the way I phrase for you, traumatic reorganization of relational trauma. So what we have done here, we did a meta-analysis, and we distinguished PTSD non-relational trauma, okay, so people suffering of post-traumatic stress disorder from natural catastrophe, from accidents, versus people with the relational trauma, meaning childhood aversive experiences. Given the number of studies, we also include intimate partner violence, we included sexual abuse, we included complex PTSD, that is a new, not so new, but is finally recognized by the ECD-11, but not the DSM-5. It's a diagnosis that has the same symptoms of PTSD, plus a disorder of self-organization. So the self of these people is very much impaired. Similar to borderline patients, but different. Yeah? So, but it is another story. What did we find? We found that people with PTSD non-relational, in processing emotion, can still recruit the mental self, the anterior cingulate cortex. So in dealing with emotion, they can recruit the mental self. People with relational trauma, they process emotion mainly with intero and exteroceptive regions. So this, for us, was a nice confirmation of our model. A very nice confirmation. As you can see, I'm pretty proud of this. So, and 5 minutes, thanks. I'm almost finished. So this is kind of the model I presented you. So this is top-down versus a bottom-up approach. Now, I'm in my conclusion now. So here I want just to thank you, my colleagues. So Lorenzo Lucherini, Angeletti, and Bianca Ventura, we do science, but when you do it with friends, it has another taste. We share our experience in Canada a lot, and mainly Lorenzo worked on anorexia nervosa, and we are currently working on this. So anorexia nervosa is another psychopathological example of a disorder of interoceptive bodily self. So he and Haas wrote kind of few papers on this, but this is the model that we have in mind. So even though striving for an ideal body image frequently functions as a gateway to the disorder, the actual conflict in anorexia consists in a severe alienation of the self from the body, which is increasingly experienced as an external alien object and subjected to authoritarian regime. It's not the case that, if you investigate the internal representation of significant others, there is also a scale for that, anorexia people have a very severe problems with mothers usually, yeah? But, I don't want to go into that. So they treat their body as non-self, okay? And this has, of course, psychologically and physically implication, very severe symptoms, and you should help as a clinician these people to get to be connected again. How? We are working on this spatial temporal psychotherapy that doesn't want to be a specific approach. So we are probably more interested in the non-specific factors across psychotherapies, okay? So that's what we study. And for us, the goal is to build a secure psychophysiological baseline and to reorganize the brain and psychological self of these individuals. It's very close to what Bromberg said when he said the health is the ability to stand in the spaces between realities without losing any of them. So the capacity to feel like oneself while being many. So what do we do? So this is a Porges model. So in the Porges model, so we should stay not in the hypoactivation, not in the hyperactivation. We should find a secure interaction with the patient. So we, the patients, should feel secure. So in the relational encounter. So in a zone of emotional and physiological activation in which the individual is able to function effectively, allowing for processing and integrated the emotion experiences, not dissociating, not dysregulating. So that's our aim. To do that, we are studying these 3 levels of self, but especially the first 2 in the interaction. And this is the synchronization or attunement between patient and therapist. How do we do that? We study the heart, we study the breathing, we study the movements, all the nonverbal expression. And this is a paper that hopefully will be published soon. So we are not very interested in the top, like psychotherapeutic techniques, or a specific factor like empathy or like alliance. We are interested in this more, let's say, non-verbal, non-conscious experience between patient and child and the therapist. That can be like the synchrony, the variability, the flexibility, other things that are more related to the signal, right, to the biological signals. So, and that's it. So this is, again, the last picture is from one of my paper, and this is actually what we propose. We think that the therapist, as the mother, is a hidden regulator, that, with these his or her longer time scales, embed the experience of the patient to help the patient to transform and reorganize him or herself. Thank you very much.
So I think it's part of my role to get the ball rolling somewhat. So I've been thinking and reflecting on what a really rich, wonderful, nourishing day it has been so far. So thought-provoking, thought-stimulating, really, really enjoyable day. So well done to the organisers and to the speakers. As you'll be aware, neuropsychoanalysis, I'm sure most of you are involved in some way or another in the area. It's a broad church, which means there are many different researchers coming from many different theoretical perspectives, operating under many different theoretical frameworks. And I suppose the one that I'm most familiar with is the work of Mark Soames and that group. And it's not the only perspective within neuropsychoanalysis, but it's a very interesting one, I think. And from that perspective, the emphasis is very much on brainstem mechanisms and affect being the basis of our conscious experiences. So I'm very interested to hear what our panelists have to say. I think maybe the word affective consciousness wasn't used explicitly. Brainstem mechanisms weren't mentioned explicitly either, but I think there were other terms that were used and kind of intimated a similar kind of approach. So I'd be very interested to hear what our panelists have to say about the role of brainstem mechanisms and affect, basic emotional systems in that Panksepian sense, in terms of body image.
I would like to ask something to the first presentation. You were talking about...
Sorry, can you just let us know your name, please, and where you're from?
I'm Beatrice Zervas. I'm from Germany, Stuttgart. I'm a clinical psychologist and now started to research at the University of Tübingen. And I have a question to the first presentation. You were talking about the interrelationship and the images. Are there any, new ideas about the intra-relationships? Like if we read a book, how about the internal images that come up? Is that the same?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I've never been involved in empirical research on literature, although I wrote about that in 2011 with an American scholar who is a comparatist at the University of Texas, Austin, Hanna Wierzchowski. And there's a special issue coming out soon of the Texas Journal of Literature, I may misquote it, and which it's the proceedings of a webinar we ran last year on the empathy and the aesthetic of language. And Siri Ustvedt, another writer, is one of the authors contributing to this issue. Yes, basically, I think that even when we process language at least at three levels, the body comes into play. So, for example, at the phonoarticulatory level, at the semantic level, and even at the syntactic level. So, for example, when I read metaphors, linguistic metaphors that rely on touch, it has been demonstrated that the tactile part of the brain is activated. And there are other aspects of literature, for example, poetry, rhyming, rhythm. They have been studied by Professor Menninghaus and his group of empirical aesthetics at the Max Planck Institute of Frankfurt. So there is a growing literature showing that even when we read narratives that describe feelings, emotions, actions, or even when we rely on the metaphorical level of description that taps onto bodily feelings, the body comes into play, which, by the way, is a very old intuition put forward, among others, by one of the most famous Italian philosophers of the 18th century, Giovan Battista Vico, where he explicitly makes the point that in all human languages, when we refer to abstract notions, we do it by transposition of the human body, of the human parts, and of the human passions. I'm almost quoting literally. So it's an old tradition of thought that is being revitalized by empirical research.
How about inner thoughts and feelings? Like
Yeah,
it's the same.
Inner monologue. It's another example. There is empirical research showing that when you are engaged in inner speech, you activate part of the same brain machinery that is active, allowing you to openly utter words. And I think that inner monologue, it's probably a pretty recent acquisition of our species. I would bet that before the invention of writing, inner monologue was not so compelling as we are used to think, because we are grown in a culture that consider writing as a consistent part of language, tending to forget that the invention of writing is a fairly recent acquisition, no more old than 6,000 years. The images I was showing at the beginning of my presentation dates back 77,000 years, and they are among the earliest proof of symbolic thought. So symbolic thought most likely occurred in a social dimension where people, because of contingent situations, staying alive in a very inhospitable world populated by big animals, predators, and the like, were very much concerned with staying alive, and I think they spend much less time ruminating about what happened to them during daytime. So I think inner monologue is a recent acquisition, as reading silently is also a fairly recent acquisition. So, but to come back to your question again, yes, there is a quite substantial overlap between the situation when we openly utter words and when we utter words in our imagination, when we are engaged in a monologue.
Would you say that it's an aesthetic impact also when you discover something and you have an aha effect?
Yes, I mean, I think the aesthetics is much more relevant for social cognition than the mere sense of beauty or sublime. These are historical, pretty recent formalization of a relationship with the world that from the very beginning has clearly an aesthetic dimension. And I think that the aha moment, the moment of marvel, the moment of when we are surprised by something unexpected, something that is not predictable, because not everything can be predicted, has to do with aesthetics. So yes. I think that when we discover something new or unexpected, I don't know how to call it, sense of wonder, sense of marvel, something that reconfigures our place in the world, that make us look at things differently. And this is one of the driving forces of what we now designate as art. Art is so important, so crucial to define the human condition, just because, as I said at the beginning of my talk, is the real form of augmented reality. Through art, through the mediation of very specific individuals who have a kind of specific relationship to the world because of their idiosyncratic quality, creativity, capacity to feel what the layman or the laywoman is not able to appreciate, reveal hidden dimensions of reality. That's why we go to museum. We enjoy looking at artworks, we read novels, we enjoy music. Because it shows something that without art we are not necessarily aware of. And that's why I'm so annoyed with my colleagues that consider, once a colleague of mine told me, aesthetics, why do you bother to investigate this? This is something you should do once you are retired. And I'm constantly being told by my younger colleagues, please, no more aesthetics. It doesn't pay back. It doesn't pay back for your career. Everybody today speaks of multidisciplinarity, transdiscipline. I mean, we invented a bunch of words. Many people claim that, very few people practice it. The way our academic curricula are still today built discourage people to venture on these bordering fields where you aim to approach what is considered to be the property of a discipline with your own toolkits coming from another disciplines. For young researcher, it is particularly detrimental to embark themselves in this kind of multidisciplinary enterprise, unfortunately. I'm a stubborn guy, so I insist. This is one of the line of research, but I couldn't support my lab at all if I were only involved in the type of research I described shortly for you this afternoon. And this is really unfortunate.
Thank you, Vittorio.
Because if there is something specific of the human condition, this is art. Yeah. There's no question about that.
I have a question over here. Thank you.
Buonasera, sono Sergio Vinciguerra, riabilitazione, si sente? Sì. Riabilitazione neurocognitiva, perfetti, lavoro a Roma. Più vicino, ecco, sono Sergio Vinciguerra, riabilitazione neurocognitiva, perfetti, Roma. Ebbene, nella pratica operativa nostra, di noi che cerchiamo di recuperare una funzione o di modificare lo stato del corpo per varie necessità, rientra anche lo spazio dell'azione, il mondo. Ecco, abbiamo parlato di tante cose molto interessanti. Scusate.
So, in the rehabilitation, so I make a synthesis, I make it brief. So the space and the encounter with the world takes place. Okay? So what's the question now? Qual è la domanda?
La domanda è questa, che come noi parliamo di body image, dobbiamo parlare secondo me anche di world image e anche di...
So we speak about body image,
sì.
But we should also consider the world image. Okay?
Ecco, e se non del mondo perché è molto grande, dello spazio dell'azione.
So if not about the world, we should speak about the space for the action, for the agency.
Nella nostra pratica troviamo indispensabile modificare o avere la capacità di costruire lo spazio in varie patologie che seguono una neurolesione ed è l'elemento più importante poi per la risoluzione del problema.
So in the practice for recovering brain damages, so the building the space, it's very important. Building the space in the world. For the rehabilitation of brain injured people or yes.
Yeah.
Special kind of spaces.
Space.
Space.
Peripersonal space.
Also,
More.
agency is probably more agency in the space.
In a clinical setting, so inside the hospital.
Ah, okay.
How to arrange the room for the...
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. I mean, from the perspective of something like the extended mind or extended cognition,
exactly.
the environment, the clinical environment is especially important. Yeah, I've written something about this with Frank Roerich, who is he's German, but he works in London. He is a clinical psychologist and psychiatrist, I think, working with schizophrenics. And he pays particular attention to the clinical setting and what that looks like. And has the idea that we could enhance that, and has tried this with virtual reality, so that you can create within a space other spaces that patients could interact with and do so in a kind of safe way, interacting with objects or other avatars and things like that, to try to work out in some narrative framework the various problems they might be having. So I think there's a lot there to talk about, and definitely the body image is not, one shouldn't think of the body image as narrowly just the body, but if you think of the body as always in a relation to an environment, then we're really trying to capture a relational factor. So that, as I was trying to say earlier, the social factors in the environment play a large role, and in some sense, those social factors are part of the world image, I suppose, of what you want to try to capture in that notion.
We have a question over here
Grazie.
first, and then Giovanna next. There's a question over, this lady to the left, over here, please. And can I just remind people to keep their questions brief, and also if there are questions that have been put into the Zoom, could you please re-enter them, because we lost the connection. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Diana Lapsa. I'm from Latvia, Lithuania. And we are here group of medical doctors. I'm a medical doctor in psychotherapy and psychosomatic medicine. And my question is about the pain. We work with the people in pain every day, long hours, with physical pain or mental pain. There is a war going next to our country. And what do you think, what is the impact of us as the doctors if we are listening every day all those problems and this big amount of pain?
Strong, I guess. We are absorbing everything revolving around us because we are a relational being. And as well as if you are a patient hospitalized and you can see trees from the window of your room, it turns out you are released much earlier on than a patient who cannot see greenery from the window. On the other side, on the negative side, when people deal with pain, with sufferance, day after day, the very easily predictable outcome is burnout, and that's why people who are involved in this kind of activity normally have support group, coaching, or they should have it. That doesn't happen in the public health system quite often in our country. I don't know about yours. So yes, I remember a conference a long time ago in Zagreb, and the talk was about the dreams of veterans of the Balkan Wars, and the assistant of one of the psychologists who was investigating, she was supposed to listen to the audio transcript of these veterans who were described in these terrible nightmares, and after a month of such activity, this lady had to quit. She couldn't bear it anymore. She was suffering nightmares herself. because she was somehow contagious by this pervasive, constant negativity stemming from the audio footage of those of the nightmares being described by these veterans or victims of that terrible wars that we suffered in continental Europe not long ago. So I wouldn't expect it to be different from what you described. That's typical of our being constantly affected by the social environment where we operate. So if negativity predominates around us, we are affected by that negativity, and it's up to us to challenge it through psychotherapeutic or psychological intervention. Otherwise, our helping others can be jeopardized because we are in turn affected by that negativity.
Thanks, Vittorio. Andrea, you might have something to say to that?
I mean, that's, yes, I have something to say. First, the physical pain and mental pain, you have the same networks that activate in the brain. So there is not such big difference. So if we are exposed to physical pain, physical suffering, or mental suffering, there is no different for the patients, and there is no different for the therapists or the medical doctors. And, you know, working with trauma-related patients, so it's very important, I think, to have intervision, supervision, to share that with other colleagues, otherwise, for your own survival. Yeah, and I used to make jokes with colleagues. I say that after very severe patients, my empathy tank is a little bit reduced, and I need to do something to get the tank being increased again. And so, like, yeah, that's it. That's yeah, but that's true. I mean, when you are working in a nice environment or an artistic or pleased and aesthetically environment, this change your day. Come on, yeah.
Thanks, Andrea.
Okay.
Giovanna.
Thank you. Okay, Gianpaolo Sammarco, professor of semiotics of arts and aesthetics of music. Okay. Can I speak in Italian, please? I prefer. Che non so l'inglese così bene, quindi non vorrei fare brutte figure, no? Mi esprimo meglio così, no? Allora, io, professor Gallese, trovo veramente interessante, insieme a tutti gli altri interventi, il suo contributo, ma soprattutto le sue ricerche. Però volevo chiederle una cosa specifica che ha a che fare proprio con la misurazione di quelle che sono le variabili estetiche e il mondo degli affetti, perché quando parliamo degli affetti possiamo intenderci che diamo per scontato che parliamo della sfera della soggettività, quindi dove c'è un'interazione fra due persone che si riattiva. Sorry, yeah.
The question is for Professor Gallese especially, and is about the measurements of aesthetic experiences, because when we speak about aesthetic experiences, we are talking about subjectivity in relation with someone or something else.
Sì, quando parliamo degli affetti ci riferiamo alla sfera della soggettività.
When we speak about affects.
Yeah. Quando parliamo invece dell'estetica, cioè ciò che è bello e brutto e viene comunque attribuito dal soggetto, parliamo invece di una rappresentazione oggettiva del vissuto che un'opera evoca.
Non so se sono d'accordo su oggettivo, però perciò mi sono fermato un attimo.
Che puoi spiegare?
Cioè, quindi però devo capire un attimo, cioè stai facendo una differenza fra affetti
e sfera della soggettività. E l'estetica invece...
So it's making a difference between the experience of affects between two people or the relationality and the experience of aesthetics, right?
The attribution of aesthetics, the aesthetic value of the art.
Yeah, okay, so the you're translating yourself. So
no, for example,
I have to say, sometimes Italian is so convoluted, so that it's difficult to summarize things. So I guess if you try to express, to translate yourself, it might be better.
Thank you. E quindi la domanda è questa: quando ha fatto queste misurazioni, no, e ha posto poi il quesito alle persone, perché chiedere ti piace o non ti piace è diverso da chiedere è bello o non è bello, questo intendevo. perché Caravaggio può essere considerato, credo universalmente, bellissimo, saturo in senso bioniano del termine della saturazione estetica adesso. Sì, sì. Però qui entra anche la sfera culturale, poi, no? Diamo il tempo di tradurre se...
I just summarize it. So asking you like it or you don't like it is very different from is beautiful or is not beautiful.
Quindi la domanda, qual era il quesito e se pensa che ci sia una differenza, come potremmo misurarla e se ci sono implicazioni su differenti aree funzionali o processi differenti.
The question is, what did you exactly ask to participants? And because it's different to ask how, we wanted explicitly to get rid of the subjective part of the issue. How much do you like it? We wanted to ask what, as you just said, is reportedly the more objective way to think about an aesthetic relationship with an artwork. Quindi noi abbiamo voluto, sì, faccio tutto io, abbiamo voluto esplicitamente evitare la soggettività, supposto che anch'io ho molti dubbi, come il collega, che vi sia una definizione oggettiva di che cos'è bello. Quindi noi abbiamo chiesto quanto artisticamente bello, secondo te, è quell'immagine. And even within this objective realm, so getting rid of the subjectivity, how much do you like it? Most experiments tap on that. La maggior parte degli esperimenti riguarda la parte soggettiva. We were aiming to show, and we were successful in that respect, that even the supposedly more canonical, more culturally driven, more objective way of rating an artwork, nevertheless could show again a relationship with the body. Because this is exactly what we found. The more they activated the brain network that activates when you feel pain or where you recognize pain in the body of someone else, the more they rated those artistic images as artistically beautiful. And let me add something to aesthetic judgment. I think that aesthetic judgments, particularly objective aesthetic judgments, are overemphasized. Yesterday I spent the midday in Scuderia del Quirinale to visit a wonderful exhibition of Guercino and the age of Papa Ludovisi. It's wonderful. But I was never engaged in rating how beautiful or how much did I like those paintings. There were paintings that captured my attention, and I went back several times to watch them again. It always happens like that to me, and I assume to many other museum or art exhibition visitors. We pass by hundreds of paintings that leave us totally unaffected. I could count on the fingers of one hand the paintings that yesterday had a huge impact, emotional, affective, cultural, theoretical, whatever, among the many paintings that were on display. They are all displayed there because they are considered masterpieces. The painters are considered great artists. Nevertheless, very few of them had a huge impact on me, and those are specifically the paintings I spend more time looking at again and again and again and again. And if I walk out of the exhibition and I meet a friend who also had the same experience, and she asked me, how much did you like that Annibale Carracci? Then I reflect upon my previous experience, and I can translate that experience into words and even formalize and say, oh, I enjoyed enormously, I think it was wonderful, I think it was great, much more than the same subject being addressed by another painter. There are similar subjects realized by different painters, portraits of popes, of cardinals. There is a Van Dyck, there is a Guido Reni, and there is a Guercino. And the Van Dyck, in my opinion, is the best of the three. So I can formalize that later on, but it's a late translation. So we don't spend our time with the Likert scale telling how much do you like this or that. It's a later event that occasionally never occurs. So I think we overemphasize this objective measure of artistic beauty, more than what normal people do.
I don't know if it's me. I'd like to ask you a question.
We have a question here in front of you. Just Giovanna, has been waiting for a while. Thank you.
Grazie, scusi. Giovanna, appunto, Tatti. Have a question, a short question for Professor Scalabrini. Very short. If I understood well, when you were talking about dissociation, you said something like, I take some notes, that there are some people with more predisposition to dissociate. So then they dissociate. But my question is, what is this predisposition related with?
So that's a very nice question. Okay, so dissociation. So according to the model that we are developing, and I mean this is Clara Mucci model, and she speaks about early relational trauma, according to Alan Shore or Giovanni Liotti. Okay, so people that experience more misattunement between mother and child, during the infancy, or people that disorganized attachment, they are more predisposed to dissociate. Okay, what does it mean? At the brain level, our brain integrate and de-integrate all the time, and this entire, there is desynchronization between areas and stuff. So it's like you have rooted in yourself a predisposition to dissociate. So when you encounter a stimulus that is too intense or can be perceived as too traumatic, you experience dissociation more than other people. Another example, so the Twin Towers in 2001 in New York. So they made a lot of studies about people, who was reacting, expressing post-traumatic stress symptoms, and people that were more resilient. Okay. So people that were more predisposed to dissociate, meaning that had a severe adverse relational experiences, more traumatic experiences during the child, disorganized attachment, they developed more symptoms of PTSD and stuff like that. Another thing, so there are studies by Raquel Yehuda or something like this from New York that are very, very interesting. People that are born in families of survivors are more predisposed genetically to dissociate. They have increased level of cortisols and other, biomarkers, even if they didn't experience any trauma. But, they encounter an external stimulus that can be triggering, a trigger for expressing more symptomatology. So that's what I mean when I say predisposed is not genetically predisposition. Is experience-related predisposition, so it's always relational. But in this case, there is also the intergenerational transmission that is intriguing. I don't know if I responded, but that's okay.
This colleague over here to the left.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My name's Domenico Timpano. I'm from Rome. I'd like to ask you, what do you think about online sessions based on the concepts you highlighted today? So, because it's intriguing, the effect of these presentations that let us imagine that we are enabled to find new explication of what happens between individuals, even though they are connected remotely. What do you think about it?
You mean online therapeutic session?
Therapeutic, and
I discussed that at length with many friends who are colleagues of yours, recently with Paolo Migone, and he was telling me that there are different styles that works better or not with different patients. With some patients, he experienced that the remote connection was favoring the relationship. With others, it doesn't. With some patients, it's better to rely just on the audio, turning the video off. With others, it works the other way around. I don't think there is a rule that is good for all therapists and all type of patients. Definitely, the relationship is completely on different basis. It also depends on the setting. I mean, if your setting implies the couch, not being able to look at one another's eyes is not so important. If you have a face-to-face setting, what you can never do, unless Elon Musk will come up with some idea, you can never look in the eyes the other, because either you look at the other or you look at the camera. It's impossible to meet the gaze of another person with a remote video connection. So I'm not a therapist myself, so my answer is probably not so relevant. But the people, the therapists I talk to, they seem to use it more and more. Not only with patients that move to a different cities or to a different countries and nevertheless want to keep this therapeutic relationship alive, but sometimes also with people that live in the same city and because of laziness, because of a variety of reasons, they prefer to have a therapeutic relationship which is digitally mediated. It is definitely going to be more and more diffuse, if you ask me. My bet would be that we'll see more and more therapeutic relation digitally
Just briefly,
mediated.
in my experience, it works better if I mix the two possibilities, in person and online. Are you able to explain, not intuitively, because it's quite easy, that two are better than one methods. Are you able to explain why this mixture of session, both in person and online, improves the quality of the connection and relationship?
No. No. How could I possibly? I would like to add one last comment. What definitely is impossible to have with an online session, coming back also to the notion of the space of action. I mean, when you are in your office with the patient, you share a physical presence within the same physical environment, which is a terzo. Both for you is not your home, and for the patient is not the patient's home. So I ask this, and some therapists go to their office, they don't do online therapy from home, and many of the patients relate to their therapist also not from home, but from the car quite often, because the quality of, I don't know how to translate it in English, terzietà, something, suppose that you are a traumatized woman, beaten by your husband. How can you possibly feel at ease with your own therapist if you speak from home? I mean, the same environment where you suffer the violence. So moving out of your place, visiting your therapist office has also this aspect that is totally absent if you need to close yourself in the bathroom with the danger of being heard by your partner and the like. So to designate a place that is safe for the patient and has nothing to do with the living environment of the therapist is something that can be hardly rebuilt in a dialogue occurring through digital mediation. But more than that, I couldn't add because you bring me out of my comfort zone. So to speak.
I would like to add something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because Vittorio, just with your examples, you make me feel the urge to intervene. I mean, I'm not against online therapy, but you should understand what works for whom. So according to the model I presented, so there are kind of pathologies that are purely bodily related. How can you work online without having the same space and same shared space for the intercorporeality happening? Because when you work online, at least it's my experience, you virtually substitute the experience with images, but the images are not the same of pure affective and corporeal experience. So it depends on the level. So I rely with Otto Kernberg, personality organization. Neurotic patients I can work with online. More traumatized patients, like also borderline organization, it's much more difficult for me.
Just to say to Scalabrini, but I remember brain synchronization is the same if you are online or if you are in the same room. It doesn't change anything, just the body, the peripersonal spaces, this changes. But from the brain synchronicity, I remember north of last year, the same questions at our center in Rome. He said, is the same brain synchronization if you are online or if you are in the same room? I remember this, I don't know.
They're doing a lot of studies now. So now we are trying to match not only the brain, but also the breathing, the heartbeat, and so we are studying more variables, trying to look for complexity matching. Because maybe if you isolate the brain, maybe the brain can connect, but you don't know if you have an effect on other. I don't know how to answer yet. Hopefully soon we will.
I think we have time for one very brief question. This gentleman here.
If I move the dog tails, is it happy? Se muovo io la coda del cane, è felice?
Do you mean if you move the dog tail?
Mechanical. The dog moves the tail when he's happy.
Yes.
If I move the dog tail, is he happy?
No. I don't think so. I don't know. I have cats at home.
This is very important